Thanks for clicking on Wayne.com. This is the Week 7 edition of Inside the Zone. I don't want to be that guy that at the beginning of every show is like, oh my gosh, can you believe we're into Week 7? But literally after this Friday, after the month of September ends, we've only got 2 more weeks and it's the playoffs. So we are really closing in on things. I think last week we thought we'd have more definition into specifically the SAC of how that was going to shake out. And then Homestead decided to throw a wrench. So we got SAC rivalry week, but I want to take a look back first before we get into this week's matchups. What do you make of the SAC, specifically that Homestead win against an undefeated Snyder team previously that now shakes things completely up when it comes to the SAC?
Well, it shows that Homestead is good enough to beat anybody on their schedule and maybe not so good enough to lose to anybody on their schedule. I can't figure out Homestead. I don't know if Chad Zolman can figure out Homestead. Depends on the week. And last week they just put everything together. We did a very good job at limiting that running attack for Snyder, and then conversely was able to run the ball significantly well with Brett Fox. So when you looked at where we thought Snyder had the definitive advantage in the SAC, it was up front, and Homestead did a great job really taking that away on both sides for the Panthers.
This time last week, we were sitting there thinking, okay, one more game, and Snyder has basically put the SAC on ice with Lures as a possibility to also go undefeated due to the fact that they've played well. They were undefeated at that time and still are in SAC play and do not face Snyder and Carroll over the stretch of the end of the season. But now we've got 4 teams in the SAC's A division, Snyder, Carroll, Dwenger, and Homestead, all 3-1. And then Lures lurking there with that was a huge win. I don't think people realize what a big win it was for Lures against Northside last Friday night.
It was, because it was one of their remaining hurdles that we look at to potentially win the SAC outright if they can go undefeated. This week you got Bishop Dwenger, and then in a couple weeks you have Homestead. That's pretty much it that stands between the Bishop Lures and a victory bell at this point. And even if they go with 1 loss, now all of a sudden you're looking at how do they factor in with the tiebreaker. So one of the negatives for not playing everybody in the league with the 2 non-conference is you could have several teams that finish with only 1 loss and you can't break the tie. So we could see that scenario here in a couple weeks based on what happens.
We're getting out the abacus. We are adding everything up. We've got a flow chart. It's a beautiful mind, with all the numbers floating in the air. That's where we're at. So let's talk about SAC Rivalry Week. This is one of the most fun weeks of the year, especially if you're an SAC fan. So when you look at Homestead versus Carroll, that's one of the ones that certainly takes the headlines. And you've also got Bishop Lures hosting Bishop Dwenger in the Battle of the Bishops. So how do you see that one playing out, knowing that a lot of people are talking about Homestead Carroll, but in terms of importance, I would put Bishop Lures and Bishop Dwenger ahead of that.
I thought we were going to start at Concordia and Wayne, that huge rivalry.
We're going to skip it. We're going to skip it. We're going to skip it with no natural rivalry,
But the Battle of the Bishops, from what we saw out of Bishop Lures the first 2 weeks of the season, when they played the 2 out-of-conference games with any 8 teams, and you were like, ooh, I don't know how this is going to go for Bishop Lures. How they looked in week 2 to now going into week 7, exponential change, right? And we're able to pull off that game. A back-and-forth game against Northside, and was able to escape with the victory. And now you go into, it seems like with each successive week, Bishop Lures is becoming more and more confident, and now they get to face their rival in Bishop Dwenger. Bishop Dwenger wants to prove something. Bishop Lures wants to continue to roll, so there's a lot on the line here in the Battle of the Bishops.
When you take a look at Homestead Carroll, how do you see this one playing out? Because Carroll, we talk a lot about Homestead, and they got the headlines last week, and rightly so for that upset of Snyder. But Carroll, I was at the Carroll-Wayne game. They struggled mightily with Wayne, and a lot of it seemed to be self-inflicted penalties, and also, a couple interceptions early from Jimmy Sullivan. How do you see this one playing out? How does Carroll bounce back? Because 17-10 against Wayne, they have that performance again this week. They will not be walking home with a victory.
No, not at all. And you're looking at even further, and you're saying if Carroll wants to be a factor in 6A, they need to figure things out because they're just eking by right now in terms of performance, particularly offensively. I'm not smart enough to look at Carroll and say this is the problem and they need to diagnose it, but I look at an offense that just looks completely out of sync. You have a running game that's struggling. You have a passing game in Jimmy Sullivan that's completing less than 50% of his passes.
Yeah, he's 49%.
This year, which is just astounding after an incredible sophomore season. But I think it's a collective thing. It's I don't know if it's scheme, it's execution, it's all of the above. But I think Carroll really needs to sit down and say, man, all of a sudden we only have 3 games left in the regular season. Forget the SAC at this point. Take that out of the equation. How are we going to play our best football going into the playoffs when we're only eking out wins over Wayne by 7 points, and you expect to do some serious damage in the sectional when you look at Penn in there and Warsaw? I mean, it's no joke. So Carroll is really going to have to figure things out offensively.
I don't know how much you studied this game because you probably didn't think I was going to ask you about it. It's not super sexy, but it has got a lot of history behind it. The totem pole game, Northside, Southside. Southside and Concordia going into last week, I mean, I just figured that was a toss-up between two teams that had struggled and hadn't won a game. Southside really put it on Concordia, and they did it. They got a freshman quarterback. They got a freshman running back in Irby that really busted out in last week's game. And Northside might or might not have Tay Johnson this Friday night.
Yeah, all indications is they won't. I mean, if the IHSAA rules are followed and you get thrown out of a game, you miss the subsequent game, which would mean he's out for the totem pole.
I remember that from my high school soccer days. So yes, that used
those
to
red cards.
That used to be a rule. I did have the record for red cards and yellow cards in Munsonboro soccer history. So,
but when you look at that, is now you look at confidence out of Southside. They get that win in convincing fashion, and they're coming in feeling really good about themselves. And you have a Northside team that, even after last week, just seems to be teetering on complete collapse at this point. Inside, I mean, just all the issues that went on at Northside last week, before that game, during the game, after the game. It's just like, where is the mentality of Northside right now? You're not going to have your star player unless something crazy happens and you get a waiver from IHSAA. And we saw how Bronte Johnson impacted this team once he was put behind center.
Right.
And the struggles we saw out of them the first 3 games. I don't know if Southside has what it takes to win this game, but I don't think it's something that people need to be glossing over whatsoever.
I hope that there's not a diss track this week.
There
was a diss track last week.
Yeah, those things were not around when we were in high school.
Thank God. Thank God.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the NE8 because really, I know you look at the score and it's 21-7 and New Haven won against Columbia City last week. And you take a look at the NE8 standings and how that impacted it. New Haven is obviously the team to beat from here on out. But really a good football game. I think it lived up to the hype. Columbia City was up 7-6 on a great touchdown catch from Stratton Fuller in the first half. What did you learn from that game? What do we take away from that game, other than the fact that New Haven is obviously now the team to beat in that conference?
They are, and I think it was a great effort by both teams. It was similar to that Snyder-Carroll game, and we came out of it going, okay, well, Snyder's the best team in the SAC, but then you look at it and say, well, without 2 pick sixes, maybe Carroll wins that football game. They were close enough to say if they played 10 times, each team would win a fair amount of times, and I think that's kind of where we were at with New Haven and Columbia City on Friday night. New Haven just happened to be the better team that night, but there are circumstances over 10 games where you see Columbia City winning that game. So New Haven did what it needed to do, even without Mylan Graham in the second half, and really was able to pull one out and in exciting fashion against Columbia City with that long run at the end, really capping that victory to make it look a little bit less close than it was. But Columbia City did a lot of good things, just did not execute when it needed to. Third downs were a big problem for them offensively. They can clean those up. They have a good shot against East Noble.
And we know their schedule. It has for years. It's been backloaded.
Right.
And so they're really getting into the teeth of it now. That counts this week where they host East Noble in what is going to be the biggest NE8 game of the week. And it feels like, mathematically, basically is an elimination game.
Right.
Hoping that New Haven stumbles if you're one of those 2 teams.
And East Noble's looked pretty good over the last couple weeks.
You
can question the quality of opponent that they've played, but Xander Brazel has found a rhythm with that team, and the defense has played tremendously well. So it's an East Noble team that has a lot of confidence, and confidence can mean a lot of things in football, particularly prep football, and East Noble's feeling pretty good. Columbia City now has to put last Friday behind them and focus because, as you mentioned, that schedule is backloaded. They have no time to really feel bad about themselves. They need to get ready, again, to play a good Knights team.
After the first few weeks of the ACAC, this is one of the weeks that we were looking forward to from the fact that Bluffton and Heritage are squaring off. Everyone had AC as the number 1 team, and then we wondered who was going to be 2, 3, 4. It looks like South Adams, maybe even Jay County, is the 4th best team, but we've got Heritage and Bluffton. Obviously, Adams Central took care of Heritage recently. However, Bluffton continues to look the part. And this is a real, I don't want to say put up or shut up game for Bluffton, but it's a let's see what you're made of type of game when they face a good 3A team like Heritage and do it on the road Friday night.
Well, I think you're looking at 3 weeks, the final 3 weeks of the season. We're finding a lot about Bluffton, who should probably, at least in one poll, be the number 1 ranked team in 2A this week. They have Heritage Adams Central, Lakeland. Combined, those three teams are 16-2. And you talked to Coach Brent Kunkel, and he said, we're going to find out a lot about who we are the next 3 weeks. They're focusing on Heritage, but they're looking at the next 3 weeks as really indicative of where they're at. It starts with Heritage. They're a tremendous team. They got that good win, I think, that people were overlooking against LaPel last Friday out of conference, and you look at them trying to keep it going. It's a tough challenge for Bluffton, significantly tougher than any that they have faced this year, and it only gets more difficult from there with Adams Central looming in Week 8.
What are the big keys? Because you look at Bluffton, and their offense has been fairly balanced. Cooper Craig has been a revelation for them running the football,
Right.
but really Braxton Betancourt. A lot of times, you see smaller school teams, and they're just have an ability to run the football.
Yeah.
But Bluffton can do both, and their defense is underrated at times as well, I think. Andrew Hunt's been a big playmaker for them offensively.
Yeah, they really set the tone in that South Adams game with their physicality on both sides of the football, and I think that's going to be the key against Heritage too for Bluffton is come out, instill your will, be tough, stay on the right side of the line, obviously, and avoid penalties. But they are really thrive when they're able to throw their weight around in the trenches and in the open field on defense, and I think that's going to be key. And also keying on Kobe Meyer as well, the Heritage quarterback.
And then the flip side, if you're Heritage, what do you really need to do? Because this is a team that's we're not as bad as 38-0 against Adams Central. That was a rough night for Coach Kolkman and company, and this could be a bounce back game for them. I imagine they have it circled on their schedule.
Yeah, that says more about Adams Central than Heritage. I think that game, that blowout loss to the Flying Jets. But for Heritage, I think it's matching that intensity for Bluffton and not getting too big for the moment because they are going to take on a team that is going to be ranked number 1 in Class 2A, probably in the AP poll. So when you look at that and the magnitude of that, it's going to be a big game. Can Heritage match that intensity?
I was surprised when the IFCA poll came out on Sunday and it had Bluffton as 3.
Yeah, right?
But I was like you. I figured the two teams ahead of them lost in the AP poll, and they would be number 1 on Tuesday, but in the AP poll, well, we don't know. We'll see.
AP poll, they were 2 last week, so I would expect them to go
That's
up
right.
to number 1.
That's right.
Let's
Let's talk a little bit about what is going to be our highlight zone game of the week because it is the game that most directly impacts a conference championship this week. And we're talking about the NECC Big Division where you have undefeated West Noble, who has been a juggernaut, hosting a 5-1 Lakeland team whose offense has been really good. But again, you take a look at their schedule, like Columbia City, it's fairly backloaded with the better teams that we play in week 7, 8, and 9.
Yeah, they do. And you look at West Noble, and the big thing with them is nobody's been able to slow down that running game. Seth Pruitt has been phenomenal. Drew Yates has been very good at quarterback and managing that offense. And it's just a team that has instilled its will against the first 6 opponents on its schedule. And they're 6-0 for a reason. And it starts offensively. And you look at Lakeland and you say, well, we've seen them put up some eye-popping numbers offensively, but how are they going to do defensively against that really good rushing attack for West Noble? So I'm looking forward to that matchup up in Ligonier. It should be a fun one.
That's the thing is if it gets into a shootout and it's the last team, with a football that scores to win the game, Lakeland can hang with them. The problem is if they get especially if West Noble gets up early and gets a few stops and then is able to grind it out on the ground, they're another team that in 3A they can throw it, they can run it.
Yeah.
We've seen in years past where it's just been run dominant for West Noble, but you're right, Drew Yates throwing to Xavier Yates, throwing to Mikhail Bottles, throwing to whoever.
Right.
It's been pretty balanced for them offensively. So if you're West Noble, are you just looking to make a statement in the first quarter and try to put Lakeland behind the football, turn them over, 3 and out them, or do something like that where you put up a couple points that are up a couple scores and have to make Lakeland play from behind?
Yeah, I think so. You look at that and you look at a really good junior class for West Noble and the guys you mentioned mostly juniors, and then conversely you say, okay, if Lakeland can get up, a team that's built on a lot of sophomores centered around Braden Holbrook, the quarterback, and you say if they can get up and then all of a sudden West Noble needs to pass to try to get back into the game, how does that affect West Noble? Because the Chargers have been able to get ahead comfortably and use that rushing attack to really dominate. So I think eventually you face a team that slows you down and makes you do something out of your comfort zone. We saw that with Columbia City, who set the tone through the first half of the season, being able to run the football. New Haven was able to stop it enough to force Columbia City to the air, and that hurt them. Other than Stratton Fuller going off. So eventually you face a team that's going to slow you down running the football. Could that be Lakeland? We'll find out because West Noble has not faced a team that hasn't been able to do it yet.
Yeah, and Sean Conley has over 1,000 yards rushing for Lakeland, had a huge game against Angola. So you're talking about a team that, in Lakeland we do think about Holbrook and the way they throw it. But those two guys are sophomores.
Yeah.
You know, they've got a lot of good football ahead of them and look like players for the future. And, you know, Ryan O'Shea with that lineage and knowledge of how to run an offensive scheme, pretty impressive. But, you know, you're talking 6-0 versus 5-1 for essentially the big division title. It could be a good night on Friday night in Ligonier.
Should be fun, a good one between two really good teams. And as you mentioned, there's so much hype around the SAC and Rivalry Week and NE8, but this is the one that directly impacts what's going to happen in the big division of the NECC.
What are you most looking forward to here in Week 7? Because we are getting down to the nitty-gritty of conferences, but also with an eye towards the postseason.
This week's all about bragging rights in the SAC. You know, you can kind of throw out where you're at in the standings. You have North-South, you have the Battle of the Bishops, you have Homestead-Carroll, and I think you kind of those three in particular in the SAC always live up to the hype. There's always a lot of talk going back and forth and just looking with what could happen. Homestead, you never know what you're getting each and every week with Homestead.
Yes.
Can Southside continue to build? Can Northside bounce back? What about Dwenger and Lures? I mean, there's a lot of storylines in those three rivalry games this week.
And we will have it all covered on what is our show? The Highlight Zone.
Yeah, that's what
on
it
Friday.
is.
But
Tune in.
on Inside the Zone, we'll have it all covered as well. Next Monday here on Wayne.com. For Justin, I'm Glenn, and we'll see you next week where we're talking Week 8.